December 23, 1944. Gleize, Belgium. Snow falls steadily over a small cluster of houses, where the most advanced German spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive sits motionless. Its tanks silent, not because American fire has destroyed them, but because their fuel tanks are empty. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored task force that had driven deeper and faster into American lines than any other German unit committed to the offensive, has spent a week fighting through increasingly desperate circumstances. Blown bridges, unexpectedly stubborn American resistance, roads clogged with its own supporting traffic. But it is not combat that finally stops it. It is arithmetic. The task force had been planned from the outset to run on fuel it did not yet possess, its own tanks carrying barely enough to reach the first day's objectives, with the rest of its advance dependent entirely on capturing American fuel depots along the route before its own tanks ran dry. That fuel, in the quantities the plan required, never materializes. Now, surrounded and immobile, Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper gives the order that ends his column's advance for good: abandon the vehicles, destroy what cannot be carried, and lead the roughly 800 surviving men of his command, on foot, back through the snow toward German lines, leaving behind more than 100 tanks and armored vehicles that Allied troops will find intact in the following days, their engines cold, not from battle damage, but from empty tanks. Crews strip weapons and personal effects from vehicles they have fought in for a week, setting demolition charges where time and circumstance allow, but leaving many machines simply as they sit. Turrets still traverse toward the last direction they had fired, fuel gauges resting on empty. It is, in miniature, the story of the entire German offensive in the Ardennes. An operation of real tactical audacity, undone less by the army it faced than by a fuel supply it never had enough of to complete the plan as designed. The popular version of this story imagines Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, to which Peiper's task force belonged, delivering a clean, specific verdict to Hitler about American fuel discipline outmatching his own. A tidy comparative judgment crystallizing the campaign's central lesson in one pointed sentence. The documented record shows something blunter and considerably less polished. What Dietrich is reliably quoted as saying, in post-war interrogation and testimony, rather than any wartime dispatch to Hitler's headquarters, is not a considered comparison between German and American logistics doctrine, but an angry, almost sarcastic complaint about the plan itself. Recalling being ordered to cross a river, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in the depths of winter, with not enough tanks, not enough fuel, not enough ammunition, and barely enough roads to move on, all within an impossible timetable, and all of it, as he reportedly put it with evident bitterness, at Christmas time. It is a complaint about resources and planning, not a specific verdict on American logistics culture. The comparative judgment about fuel discipline that later attaches to his name is less something Dietrich actually formulated himself in those terms than a reasonable historical conclusion, drawn by others afterward, from what actually happened to his own army's most dangerous spearhead once its own fuel ran out and the American fuel it needed proved impossible to capture intact. To understand why Dietrich's own army finds itself in this position, the story has to begin with the man himself, whose path to command of Germany's most important panzer army in the Ardennes runs almost entirely outside the traditional general staff system that produced commanders like Guderian, Manstein, and Rundstedt. Dietrich enters the Nazi movement early, as a former non-commissioned officer from the First World War who had served in tank units during that conflict's final year, and rises through the ranks of the SS, not through formal military education, but through personal loyalty to Hitler, commanding the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Hitler's own bodyguard formation, from its earliest days as essentially a ceremonial and security unit before it expands into a full combat division, fighting on multiple fronts, from the invasion of Poland and France through extensive service on the Eastern Front, and later, in Normandy following the Allied invasion. Dietrich's involvement in the killings of the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler orders the elimination of rivals within his own movement, killings Dietrich personally oversees in Munich, executing several of the arrested men himself according to post-war testimony, cements his standing as one of the regime's most trusted enforcers, a political reliability that matters considerably more to Hitler than formal command experience when the time comes to select leadership for the Ardennes offensive's most important formation. Despite his lack of formal staff training, Dietrich earns a reputation among the men who serve under him as a genuinely courageous and popular commander, someone who shares hardship with his troops and inspires real loyalty at the unit level, even as more conventionally trained officers question whether that same popularity translates into the operational sophistication needed to direct an army-sized formation through a campaign as complex as the one now being planned. By late 1944, Dietrich commands the newly formed 6th Panzer Army, redesignated 6th SS Panzer Army, assigned the main effort of the entire Ardennes plan, the northern thrust intended to reach and cross the Meuse River before driving on to the ultimate objective of Antwerp, a command built around the elite 1st and 12th SS Panzer divisions and given priority over fuel and equipment allocation ahead of the other German armies committed to the offensive. Professional army officers serving under and alongside him frequently regard Dietrich's promotion to this level of command with open skepticism, viewing him as a capable troop leader and a fiercely loyal Nazi, but not a commander equipped by training or temperament for the demands of directing an entire panzer army through the kind of complex, multi-phase operation the Ardennes plan requires, a skepticism that, whatever its fairness to Dietrich personally, reflects a broader tension throughout the German war effort by 1944 between political reliability and professional military competence as the criteria by which senior commands are increasingly assigned. The fuel problem that ultimately defeats Kampfgruppe Peiper is not a localized failure of planning within Dietrich's own army, but a structural weakness built into the entire Ardennes offensive from its conception. By the autumn of 1944, sustained Allied strategic bombing of German synthetic fuel production facilities, a deliberate target priority within the broader strategic bombing campaign that Allied air commanders had identified, correctly, as one of the most effective ways to cripple German mobile operations, striking plants at Leona, Pölitz, and elsewhere that produced the majority of Germany's aviation and motor fuel from coal rather than imported crude oil. A campaign that intensifies dramatically through the second half of the year has reduced German fuel stocks to a fraction of what full-scale mobile operations on the scale of the planned offensive would normally require. Reserve stocks that German planners had painstakingly accumulated over the preceding months, intended specifically to fuel an offensive of this scale, are consumed at a rate that leaves the overall operation with what post-war assessments describe as only a narrow margin above the bare minimum needed to reach the first significant objectives, with essentially no cushion for the kind of delays that any offensive of this complexity should be expected to encounter. German planners calculate that the fuel actually available can sustain the attacking armies only through the first several days of the operation, at which point advancing panzer divisions are expected, by design, not as a contingency, to refuel substantially from captured American fuel depots along their route of advance. It is a gamble built into the operational plan at the highest level, acknowledged by senior planners including Hitler's own headquarters staff, who nonetheless proceed with the offensive rather than delay it further while fuel stocks continue to shrink under ongoing Allied bombing, calculating that further delay would only worsen the fuel position rather than improve it. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, tasked with the fastest and deepest advance of the entire operation, depends on this gamble more heavily than any other formation committed to the offensive, and Kampfgruppe Peiper, as the spearhead of the spearhead, is planned from the outset to carry only enough fuel for the opening phase of its advance, with the remainder of its route mapped explicitly around the locations of known American fuel depots the task force is expected to seize largely intact. Peiper's advance, beginning on December 16, 1944, encounters difficulty almost immediately, though not primarily from the fuel shortage that will eventually stop it. Unexpectedly determined American resistance around the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath delays the advance in its opening hours, inflicting losses on the leading elements of Peiper's task force that, while not decisive on their own, cost precious hours the tight schedule cannot easily absorb. And American engineers, recognizing the operational logic behind the German thrust, systematically demolish key bridges along Peiper's intended route, forcing repeated, time-consuming detours that compound the delay, hour by hour, and forced the column onto secondary roads, never intended to carry the volume of armor and support vehicles, now crowding onto them. The column that reaches Stavelot on December 18th is already running well behind the schedule the entire operation depends upon, and it is at Stavelot and in the surrounding area around Francorchamps that the gap between the plan's assumptions and reality becomes starkest. American forces in the area, alerted to the danger posed by an enormous fuel depot near Stavelot containing several million gallons of gasoline, precisely the kind of prize Peiper's advance had been planned around capturing, move quickly to evacuate or deny the bulk of the stockpile before German forces can secure it intact. In one of the more consequential logistics decisions of the entire battle, one made under considerable time pressure by American quartermaster and engineer personnel who understand, correctly, exactly what losing that fuel intact to the advancing German column would mean for the wider battle. Peiper's column does briefly occupy portions of Stavelot and pushes on toward Trois Ponts and Stoumont in the days that follow, only to find the bridges at Trois Ponts already destroyed by a small American engineer detachment moments before his lead tanks arrive, forcing yet another costly detour that further separates his advance from any realistic timetable for reaching the Meuse. The fuel his plan had assumed would be waiting for him along this route is, at the critical moments, either destroyed, evacuated, or simply never in the quantities his advance requires, forcing his tanks to draw down reserves that were never sufficient to complete the full planned advance without exactly the kind of resupply that keeps failing to materialize. It is during this same advance, on December 17th, in the area around Malmedy, that soldiers under Peiper's command murder more than 80 American prisoners of war in a field beside the road, an atrocity documented afterward through surviving witnesses among the prisoners who escaped the shooting, and that becomes, alongside the task force's ultimate fuel-starved collapse, one of the defining and most infamous episodes of the entire Ardennes campaign, leading to war crimes charges against Peiper, Dietrich, and dozens of other members of the task force once the war ends. By December 23rd, with his column surrounded near Gleize and its fuel reserves finally exhausted entirely, Peiper's request to withdraw is approved by his superiors, and the task force that had once represented the most dangerous single threat of the entire German offensive ends not in a climactic battle, but in the quiet, deliberate abandonment of vehicles that simply cannot move any further. Peiper organizes the breakout on foot for the night of December 23rd into the 24th, moving his remaining men in small groups through American lines under cover of darkness and difficult winter terrain, a journey that takes the exhausted survivors, many suffering from frostbite and exhaustion after days of continuous combat with little rest, most of the night to complete before finally reaching German positions. The roughly 800 survivors who make the nighttime march back to German lines leave behind a column of tanks, half-tracks, and other armored vehicles that American forces recover largely intact in the days that follow, not destroyed in combat, but stranded, in most cases, with empty fuel tanks and full ammunition racks, a physical illustration of an army that had run out of gasoline rather than courage or equipment. The failure ripples upward through the entire 6th Panzer Army's operational picture. Without Kampfgruppe Peiper's spearhead maintaining pressure toward the Meuse, the northern shoulder of the German offensive, the Axis Dietrich's army had been specifically built and resourced to drive forward, stalls well short of its objectives, while German reserves and fuel allocations that might have sustained a renewed push are instead consumed trying to salvage an increasingly desperate situation across the entire salient. Dietrich's own post-war reflections on the campaign, delivered during his interrogation and later trial proceedings related to the war crimes committed during the offensive, including the Malmedy killings that occur under his overall command, proceedings that eventually result in a death sentence later commuted to life imprisonment, of which Dietrich serves only a portion before parole in the early 1950s, and a subsequent conviction in West German courts years later for his role in the Night of the Long Knives killings. Focus less on any specific technical comparison between German and American logistics systems than on a bitter, almost incredulous accounting of what he had been asked to accomplish with the resources actually available to him. The comparison to American fuel discipline that later becomes attached to his name reflects an assessment that, whatever the precision of its wording in Dietrich's own testimony, captures something genuinely true about the contrast the campaign exposes. An American logistics system capable, even under the pressure of a major surprise offensive, that achieves near-total tactical surprise against unprepared American units in its opening hours. Of recognizing the danger a specific fuel depot represented and acting quickly enough to deny it to the advancing enemy, set against a German operational plan that had built its entire chance of success around the assumption that exactly this kind of American logistics discipline would fail to materialize in time. It did not fail. The gamble that Dietrich's own army had depended upon more than any other formation in the offensive collapses at precisely the point where German planners had assumed it would succeed, and the 800 men walking back through the snow from Gleize on the night of December 23rd are the most visible, immediate evidence of what that collapse actually cost. In the abandoned column near Gleize, in the days after Peiper's survivors have made their way back to German lines, American soldiers inspecting the wreckage find tanks with their engines intact, their guns still loaded, their crew's personal effects still inside. Every sign of a unit that had been fully prepared to keep fighting, stopped not by American firepower, but by the simple absence of fuel to move another mile. Some vehicles show only the damage of demolition charges placed hastily by their own retreating crews. Most left simply as they had rolled to a final stop. Engines silent. Turrets aimed at nothing in particular. A column that in every respect except fuel remained a fully intact fighting force. It is a scene that says more about the true cause of the Ardennes offensive's failure in this sector than any report eventually filed by Dietrich or forwarded up the German chain of command. A physical record of a plan that had gambled its most dangerous spearhead on a resource it never controlled and could not guarantee, standing silent and intact in the snow as proof of exactly how that gamble failed. Whatever specific words Dietrich eventually uses to describe the campaign afterward, the tanks at Gleize had already delivered the verdict on their own. What the story of Kampfgruppe Peiper and the fuel crisis that ends its advance ultimately illustrates is a pattern that recurs across the entire German war effort by this stage of the conflict. An operational culture still capable of extraordinary tactical boldness, still able to plan and execute a surprise offensive that catches Allied intelligence largely off guard, but no longer possessing the industrial and logistical foundation necessary to sustain that boldness once the fighting itself begins. It is a pattern this same series of failures has traced across multiple theaters and multiple commanders through the final years of the war. Rommel's panzers outrunning their fuel in North Africa, Guderian's spearheads stalling short of Moscow, and now Dietrich's most elite formation abandoned intact in the snow for want of gasoline the plan had simply assumed would be there. Dietrich commands an army built for speed and shock, crewed by some of the most experienced and fanatically committed soldiers remaining in German service, and equipped, at least on paper, with some of the most capable armored vehicles fielded by either side in the entire war. None of it matters once the fuel runs out, because no doctrine, however aggressive, and no crew, however skilled, can advance on an empty tank. The verdict history eventually attaches to Dietrich's name may compress a bitter, informal complaint into something tidier than what he actually said, but the underlying judgment it represents is not wrong. His army gambled everything on capturing what it needed to win, against an opponent disciplined enough to make sure that gamble failed, and the 800 men who walked back through the snow from Gleize are the ones who paid, on foot and in the dark, for a plan that had never actually controlled the one resource its entire success depended upon.